In the few minutes that remain, I'll try to cover this very important topic. By the way, I don't understand why it's called a mündliche Prüfung. If this oral exam occurs throughout the continent, I suppose the French have their own phrase for it, and the Italians also. Does anyone have the sense that there's a kind of creeping German control of this? No? Is it just my paranoia? Well, okay. Now, dealing with the topic of liberalism, and it's inevitable that we have to deal with the terminological question. At the end of his Constitution of Liberty, Hayek considers the question, what should we call ourselves? And he says, well, we can't call ourselves liberals anymore because that's a lost cause. And he says we shouldn't call ourselves libertarians because that sounds very gimmicky and contrived. So Hayek comes to the conclusion that what we should call ourselves is old Whigs. So what's your point of view? Well, I'm an old Whig. It's a good thing that Hayek went in for theoretical economics and not marketing, I think. I have an essay coming out in the Independent Review. I don't know if you know that publication. It's put out by the Independent Institute, and Bob Higgs edits it. And my article is on was Keynes a liberal? That is, John Maynard Keynes, the famous Keynes. Was he a liberal? Everybody says he was a liberal. And I give reasons why that's incorrect and really renders the term liberal incoherent. Naturally, it's because of his support of incessant government interventions. And the person who knows everything about Keynes on that subject is Professor Salerno, if you have any interest in pursuing it. But what I mention is a radio address, a radio review that Keynes delivered in 1936, which Skidelsky, Robert Skidelsky has these 3 huge volumes, a biography of Keynes. He didn't have any room to discuss this somehow, but you can find it in Keynes's collected writings. This is a review of a book by 2 of Keynes's friends, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. And the book is Soviet Russia, A New Civilization. You've heard the term fellow traveler, probably. This is the epitome of fellow traveling literature. They got all their facts and statistics from the Soviet secret police. It's a travesty, but Keynes praises this to the skies, and he says that the British people have a lot to learn from what's going on in the Soviet Union. This is 1936. This is the heyday of the purge trials. People are being sent to the gulag by the thousands every day. And so, how's this to be explained? Well, I'm assured by everybody, Hayek, for instance, who knew Keynes, that Keynes was a very intelligent man. So, what are the possibilities? How do you explain this ridiculous, shameful review of this pro-communist book? Well, maybe like a lot of reviewers, Keynes didn't read the book. Maybe he didn't read the newspapers to find out what was actually happening in Russia. Or, the last possibility, he was a blithering idiot of David Gordon proportions. Now, the question of liberalism instantly raises this terminological point. Because if you're going to stretch liberalism to include Mises as well as Keynes, then what's the use of the concept? It's interesting that the term liberal is used in this common sense, that includes Hillary Clinton and so on, in English-speaking countries. In France, for instance, liberal still means basically our kind of people. And ultra-liberal in France would mean libertarians. Joseph Schumpeter, in case you don't know this book, it's a very useful resource. Sorry about that, the hairiness of my hand. Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, he was an Austrian economist, but not an Austrian economist. That is, he was more of a classical economist. But he wrote this very useful history of economic analysis that you can look into for. It's really an encyclopedia more than anything else, and was not completed. But in the course of that, he mentions this switchover of the term liberal, and he says the enemies of free enterprise paid it an ultimate compliment of hijacking the term liberal for their own views. Frankly, I don't understand why. So basically, liberal is used in this very loose sense that includes Keynes in English-speaking countries, in America, in Canada, and Britain. I think that the reason for that is that the Anglophone people had have a bias against anything that sounds like socialism. Crazy them. So that in logic, these people should call themselves social democrats, as they do in Germany and many other places. I don't see anything wrong with it. It's a respectable term. But I'm not going to be dealing with that kind of liberalism. Incidentally, the best known, if you've ever been assigned anything on liberalism, they've probably assigned you. See, this minimizes my hand. See?
Now it's the invisible hand.
John Stuart Mill. He wrote a famous essay called On Liberty. So you might have been assigned that. Now, Mill says at the very beginning of that essay, I'm not going to deal with economic questions. He says free trade, but he means economic liberalism. Instead, he deals with freedom of opinion and freedom of competing lifestyles. Friedman said one time, the great majority of the human race is concerned with economic freedom. The freedom to buy and sell, the freedom to work where you want to, the freedom to invest your money, and so on. Mill, however, was a stereotypical intellectual, so for him the important questions are freedom of expression and freedom of lifestyle. Now, I don't believe in psychoanalysis, but there's an obvious reason why he was concerned with problems of lifestyle. He was in love with Harriet Taylor, who was a married woman, and they had to wait until her husband passed away. There were no suspicious circumstances before they could get married. So, in other words, Mill was caught in this vice of English Puritanism. I suppose in France he could have had an affair with this lady, because what he says in On Liberty is that social pressure can be just as bad as government pressure. The pressure of social norms can be just as coercive as the pressure of the police power. As Ein says in Atlas, people who say things like that should feel the difference on their backs. The difference, because they talk about the whip, the literal whip, and then the figurative whip of economic pressure. If they can't tell the difference between being thrown into prison for your opinions and being snubbed and not invited to tea parties, Well, so this English thing, you know, lasts quite a long time. It was only in the 1950s that they changed their laws on homosexuality, which goes a lot of the way to explain, for instance, the Cambridge Four, if you've ever heard of them. The four Cambridge homosexuals who became very distinguished and so on, and were Soviet spies. They were reacting against English society. The French didn't have any laws against homosexuality from the time of the Code Napoleon. And, well, I suppose the English would think that that's what led to French decadence. But anyway, Mill, I would warn you against Mill, because he is the beginning of this turn from liberalism, meaning what it used to mean, and meaning our own point of view, and modern liberalism. Okay, now the roots of liberalism, this is going to be a condensed lecture. The roots of liberalism go back very far in history. And I don't want you to think that liberalism was something that somehow sprung up instantly from the brow of Zeus or whatever. It developed incrementally. And it was always, in the whole history of the evolution of liberalism, an interplay between social reality and thought. Liberalism was not just invented by a string of philosophers. These are philosophers who dealt with what they found in their own society and theorized about it. And in that way, if they were of a certain inclination, they advanced the cause of liberty. Now, there are two things. Now, first of all, liberalism is of the West. In fact, you could say it's of the West, defined as the nations that were or had been at one time in communion with the Bishop of Rome. In other words, Western Central Europe. Some of them, you know, went off and became Protestants, but still, that for hundreds of years, the role of the Catholic Church was very important in their history. So, the liberal idea, I say, goes back very far in Western history. We can find it in what the Romans called Palestine, where the Hebrews came up with the crucial idea that God is totally different and above his creation. No human being can claim to be God. And this the Jews held to forever. This put them in contrast with a lot of civilizations, a lot of great civilizations. The Pharaoh was a god in Egypt. The Persian Shah, king of kings, was a god. The emperor of Japan was the direct descendant of the goddess of the sun. The Chinese emperor was a god. The Jews, on the other hand, had the idea that there's man and then there's God. There are two different things. And man is subservient to God, and no man can set himself up as God. So this began, as we'll see, and I'll mention different aspects of it, this dichotomy, this division, this bipolarity of the Western world as against the monolithic character of a lot of other civilizations. And then with the Greeks, we begin to have the idea of natural law. One of your number, who shall remain nameless, happens to be an expert in ancient Greek literature. So in our question period, if we get to a question period, I obviously will not call on him. Because what I want to mention now is, for instance, the play Antigone by Sophocles, where you have there a conflict between Antigone and Creon, who is the ruler of the city. And it's a great play. You can read it. And at one point, the problem is that Antigone's brother died in rebellion against Creon. So Creon says, well, let him stay outside of the walls and being eaten by dogs and rats. That's what he deserves. Antigone can't accept that. And she says at one point, there is a law that's written in the stars before the world was made. And that's the law that she adheres to, a proper burial for her blood kin. So there, and this developed in different ways among the Greeks and also among the Romans. Cicero has an idea of natural law. This is not individual natural rights so far, but it is a natural law distinct from the government's law. And then finally in Palestine, there appeared one of their prophets that many people considered much more than just a prophet. His exploits are discussed in the first books of the New Testament called the Gospels. And at one point, the Pharisees try to trick Jesus. And they show him a coin with Caesar's picture on it, image on it, and they say, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. One of the great liberals of the 19th century was a great historian, Lord Acton. Maybe, well, I don't know if you know his name, but you know one thing that he said, which is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This was the lesson that he had gleaned from his historical research. And Acton said that statement by Jesus was the foundation of Western freedom. He was a Catholic. That is perhaps an exaggeration, but there's certainly something to it, because Acton says, because Jesus didn't only say that, he set up an institution which eventually became the most powerful institution in the West to guard that is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, through its history, has, through most of its history, has opposed state power, not because it believed in individual rights or the rights of conscience. That's not the point. Because state power infringed on their power. And this is what Acton says. And a kind of balance was achieved over time. Let's have an example here from the early centuries of the Christian era. St. Ambrose was the Bishop of Milan. If you go to Milan, you can still see what they claim are his remains. And he was responsible for the conversion of St. Augustine. Now, at one point, the emperor, who's in Constantinople by this time, I heard there was going to be a plot against me this morning. I didn't know it was going to be so overt and okay. And this is what Ambrose says. At length the command came, deliver up the basilica in Milan. But I reply, it is not lawful for us to deliver it up, nor for your majesty to receive it. By no law can you violate the house of a private man. And do you think that the house of God may be taken away? And he warns him that he's going to, the emperor, by this time the emperor's, this is the decay of the Roman Empire, and the emperor's word was law. There was nothing that the lawyers maintained that there was nothing that could limit the emperor's say-so. But Ambrose stood against it. And this is typical of what often happened in these centuries. And then the Germans came and provided a factor in the development of freedom, although it didn't necessarily seem so at the time, and that was feudalism. The German barons, Germanic barons, became the landowners in France and Germany, and Central Europe, other places. And this is important. The nature of the feudal contract was that there were obligations on both sides. The barons had obligations towards the king, but the king equally had obligations towards the barons. In other words, he did not have absolute discretion in regard to these powerful men in his country. Now, the main factor, finally, is the division of Europe. I alluded to this in my talk yesterday. There's an immense literature on why was Europe different, and maybe a good place to start would be a book called "How the West Grew Rich" by Rosenberg and Birdsall. How the West Grew Rich. There's an Australian economic historian named E.L. Jones who wrote a book called The European Miracle. A kind of provocative title, and sometimes this whole literature is referred to as the literature of the European miracle. What was the miracle? Why was it in Europe that for the first time the human race was able to avoid the Malthusian trap, named after Malthus? That is, Malthus maintained if society gets richer, what's going to happen simply is that people are going to have more kids, the more kids are going to survive, and then the per capita income is going to go down. Well, in Europe that did not happen, and it spectacularly did not happen. Why? Why did it start in Europe? And now, of course, through many parts of the world. So this is not ethnocentric in the sense that nobody else can do this. We're talking about how it happened, the history of it. And the main consideration was that Europe was divided. As a French author, Jean Bachelet, says, this was a great non-event of European history, that no empire was able to take over the continent, although the German Hohenstaufen emperors of the Holy Roman Empire tried it, but they were thwarted. The Italian city-states and the Pope stopped them, and then, of course, the Spanish kings tried it, but they were stopped. Napoleon tried it, Hitler tried it, but nobody was able to gain control of the whole continent until these bureaucrats in Brussels. So what you had was a division among different political units. So what that meant, for instance, was that if things got too bad in Cologne, a businessman, because it's always the people who have some money who, who was it? Willie Horton? No. Some bank robber was once asked, "Why do you rob banks?" And he said, "That's where the money is." Businessmen were the natural targets of predatory rulers. One interesting thing about this literature is that these authors, they're not libertarians or anything, but they constantly refer to the state as a predatory institution. The state, by its nature, will take as much as it can get away with. So what would happen as things developed in the Middle Ages? Let's say the Archbishop of Cologne was excessive in his taxation or regulations or whatever. Well, the businessman would leave Cologne, go down to the Rhine, and go to Holland. Or if Holland was a problem, across the North Sea and go to England. Because there were different jurisdictions. And one thing smart rulers learned was that if you make things reasonable, of course we want our money, but we want to maximize what we get. We don't want to lose a good tax base. So if we minimize our exactions, then it'll be to our benefit. Well, the story is a complicated one and a great one. It turned out, this is another distinction of European history, only in Europe did parliaments arise. That is, representatives of the tax-bearing classes. That's what they were originally. The king would have to come to the parliament and ask for an increase in taxes. The representatives of the people who pay taxes would have to decide whether to give it to him or not. Now, we know the English Parliament, but there were parliaments or diets or similar institutions throughout Western and Central Europe. In fact, older than the English Parliament was the Cortes of Castile and of Leon in Spain. So there were these parliaments to look out for the interests of the people. There were also decrees that, in one way or another, the rulers were forced to give. In the areas that afterwards became Belgium and Holland, there was a famous statement that each succeeding ruler had to agree to respect the laws that existed. The ruler was under the laws. The ruler was not the creator of the laws. And if he wanted more taxes, he had to go to the different diets that already existed in those areas. The most famous of these decrees is the Magna Carta, which bad King John was forced to sign. And you can read it, it's about 30 pages or something, and it's widely available. And here are some of the provisions. No scutage nor aid, basically taxes, shall be imposed on our kingdom unless by common council of our kingdom. And for the things that have to be done, the ransoming of the king, for instance, they shall not be levied more than a reasonable aid or tax. It's one of the provisions. This is the 13th century, so there's a lot of feudal law involved here. No constable or bailiff of ours shall take corn or other provisions from anyone without immediately tendering money therefor, unless he can have a postponement by permission of the seller. The king can't just send his people around and confiscate their goods. No sheriff or bailiff of ours shall take the horses or carts of any freeman. Again, the right of private property. It shall be lawful in the future for anyone to leave our kingdom and to return, safe and secure, by land and water, except for a short period of time in war on grounds of public policy. So, freedom of movement for merchants in and out of England. Nobody shall, no one shall be put on trial for capital offense except tried by a jury of his peers. And finally, it's stated, wherefore it is our will, and we firmly enjoin, that the English Church be free, that the men in our kingdom have and hold all the aforesaid liberties, rights, and concessions for themselves and their heirs. An oath, moreover, has been taken, as well as on our part, as also the barons, to witness this. This occurred in a meadow called Runnymede, between the Windsor and the Staines, on the 15th day of June in 1215, and the witnesses and guarantors of this were listed, the great barons of England, and the head was Stephen Langdon, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So this is an example of the sort of thing that was going on. Now, did the English kings always abide by this? No. But it was always something that could be pointed to by people who wanted to defend their rights in England, the Magna Carta. And finally, in the Middle Ages, there was a doctrine of natural law. This finally had become the official doctrine of the Catholic Church. It was taught in every university, from Oxford to Salamanca to the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, that the prince is beneath the law, and the purpose of the law is the common good, not the aggrandizement of the ruler. Well, this was followed by the Renaissance. Now, our idea, or the idea many people have of the Renaissance, was that this was a great release and liberation of the human spirit. Well, debatable, but in any case, from a political point of view, the Renaissance was a number of steps backward. And the typical Renaissance political philosopher was not Thomas Aquinas, for instance, from the Middle Ages, who believed in natural law and limits on the power of the ruler. The Renaissance political philosopher was Machiavelli, and really very typical of Renaissance political thought. Many of you probably have read his book, his little book, The Prince, which is a manual of how to gain and hold on to and increase power. So it was written for the prince. And I don't know how true this is, but it's said that through history, through the centuries, princes like Friedrich the Great of Prussia, or maybe Mussolini and others, have used this manual. Machiavelli was very cynical in his advice. Don't confiscate a man's property totally, because a man more easily forgets the death of his father than the taking away of his patrimony. Well, I don't want to say that this whole period up until the 18th century is one simply of absolutism, although in politics it is. The great monarchies are now beginning to develop. The introduction of gunpowder made the castles of the barons in every country very vulnerable now, and the kings more and more depended on taxation with which they bought their own armies, didn't have to depend on feudal levies. The Reformation had come in, and that now split Christianity, so that the Protestant churches, as well as the Catholic Church, looked to the state for aid against each other. The Catholic Church, which had at certain times very heroically stood against the power of the ruler and the claims of absolute power, now had to go begging to the kings for aid because they wanted to protect themselves against incursions by Protestantism. But this period is not totally without interest for our purposes. As Americans, of course, we share the English bias. The Spaniards are all extremely vicious people. Well, they do bullfighting, don't they? And cruel, and totally without any kind of merit, except maybe Velasquez and Cervantes, but aside from that. Well, I mentioned yesterday Guido's great book. Well, another book that, I don't know how your finances go, but another book which is very valuable. It's really a liberal education in itself, because it doesn't just deal with the naturally limited topics that Guido's book covers. It deals with the whole history of economic thought from the very beginning. Unfortunately, Murray Rothbard wasn't able to finish this, so it stopped short of the Austrian school. In a way, that's kind of where Guido then picks up. This is a history of economic thought in 2 volumes by Murray Rothbard. And you can see it in the bookstore here. You can look it over. Now, the reason I mention it at this point is that Murray has an excellent chapter on the School of Salamanca. They say Salamanca, it's a great university in Spain, but there were other Catholic universities involved. These were all monks, the people who wrote and contributed to this body of thought. And Vittoria, for instance, was one of the greatest of them. Murray says, this is the beginning of modern economic thought. Now, Catholic thought, economic thought in the Middle Ages for a long time had a bad reputation as being in favor of all kinds of limitations on freedom of economic movement. But Murray points out, other scholars have done research on this, for instance, the Catholic idea of the just price, according to the School of Salamanca. The just price was the competitive market price. And one thing that Murray points out, these authors of the School of Salamanca based their whole economic theory on utility. Okay? This is going to be, and this went on in the continent. The Italian economists, also then in France, and Murray's book is very interesting from this point of view. We think of the history of economic thought in terms of the British, of Adam Smith, and then David Ricardo and Malthus, and then finally John Stuart Mill. And Murray says all of those people were fatally tainted. Their theory was undermined by the fact that to one degree or another they accepted the labor theory of value. And then Marx comes along and says, well, I just accept the theories that these bourgeois economists have produced, namely that labor is the basis of all value. Murray says that the continental writers, starting with the School of Salamanca, said that no, that's not the case. The point of production is consumption, and the pleasure of the consumer. So anyway, so if you don't get a chance to buy Murray's book, you maybe can look at it. Well, of course, it's in the library also. Well, there was in this modern period an absolutist offensive, that is, absolutism in the sense of absolute power for the ruler, and the destruction of all these other institutions that had limited the ruler's power during the Middle Ages. And one by one, for instance, the different diets and in France the States General and so on went into oblivion. They had limited the ruler's power in the past, but now the kings simply swept over them. They were at best ghost institutions with no real power. However, the absolutist offensive, which looked to be on the point of conquering all of Europe, ran into some problems. The first was the Dutch. How many people here have ever heard of the revolt of the Dutch against the Spaniards? How many people here have ever heard of Harriet Taubman, whoever she might or might not be? Oh, not many? No, self-selected group. But the point is, this revolt of the Dutch against the Spanish Habsburgs is a very important landmark in the history of liberalism. It was a long struggle. It was a very bitter struggle. Finally, the Dutch prevailed against the great Spanish Empire and set up an unusual Commonwealth. There was no king, there was no ruler. The different provinces had their own diets, that is, their own regional representative assemblies. And for Holland was just one of the provinces, it was the Netherlands. And the different provincial diets sent representatives to the general diet of the Netherlands, which didn't have much power in and of itself. In other words, power was decentralized. It was a country set up by merchants, so that it was very favorable to business. And actually, the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium, had been relatively free for quite a long time under the Dukes of Burgundy. Now, the Dutch businessmen had their own way. And one of the sons of Amsterdam. See, the Dutch, as businessmen, really downplayed religious differences. They tended to be either de facto or de jure or even de facto tolerant of other religions. About a third of the population was Catholic. Well, the Calvinists were favored, but the Catholics were certainly not burned at the stake or imprisoned or persecuted in any way like that. And the Dutch opened up the door to the Jews. When the stupid Spanish kings, and then the Portuguese kings, threw out the Jews, many of them went to Holland and started this great Jewish community, very important in the economic and intellectual life of the Netherlands that existed until the time of Anne Frank. Now, one of the members of this Jewish community in Amsterdam was a philosopher named Spinoza. He was very proud of his city. This is what he wrote. The city of Amsterdam reaps the fruit of freedom in its own great prosperity and the admiration of all other people. For in this most flourishing state and most splendid city, men of every nation and religion live together in the greatest harmony and ask no questions before trusting goods to their fellow men, except whether they have credit, if they're creditworthy, and this was basically true about Holland. Now, I mentioned the division of Europe as crucial, as central to the development of liberalism, and it comes out here also, because the fact that you have different polities, different political jurisdictions, means that there's a possibility of a demonstration effect. Everybody in Europe knew that the Dutch were tremendously prosperous. Even beggars and people on welfare in Holland lived moderately well. In Spain and Naples and so on, they had to go around begging the way gypsies do now in Italy and Central Europe. But there were asylums for people, blind people, handicapped people. But in general, this was a very prosperous bourgeois society. So people saw this. Statesmen saw this and said to themselves, maybe if we adopt some of the policies of the Dutch, we can do some good for our own people. Now, very crucially, I say there was an absolutist thrust. The kings tried to get total power. The Dutch had stymied the Spanish Habsburgs, and in England, something very similar happens when the Stuart kings come down from Scotland, know nothing about English institutions, and have no idea of how deeply rooted they are, back to the Magna Carta, already four centuries plus old, and attempt to introduce the ways of continental despots. So the 17th century in England is a century of civil disturbance and revolution. They execute a king. They force another king off the throne. And what happens in times like this is people begin to look around and ask fundamental political questions. We've thrown out the king. What are we going to have? Well, what's the basis of political authority anyway? Legitimate political authority. We thought it was a succession of legitimate kings, but we don't have a legitimate king anymore. So important works were written, and this is something else you can find in Murray's book. There's a lot about a group of activists and theoreticians called the Levelers, who worked and agitated in the late 1640s and 1650s. Things developed. As I say, nothing is comes into being totally full and complete. So the Levelers began. First of all, their program was basically a libertarian program: do away with chartered government monopolies, lower taxes, do away with the expenditure of the court. Don't subsidize mercantile companies by sending troops all around the world to set up colonies. And the Levelers said, and really, I don't think we should be aiming at the total genocide of the Irish people, which the Calvinists, the Puritans who were in charge of the English government were doing. From their point of view, the Irish Catholics who believed in the real presence of Jesus in the host and actually did worship it because they believed it, consecrated host was the body of Jesus. They were idolaters. And the Old Testament tells these Puritans that the idolaters have to be destroyed. Their cousins, the Puritans up in Boston, were at around the same time hanging Quakers in Boston Common. But these Levelers said, and also this, look, we oppose the absolute power of the king. We will oppose the absolute power of Parliament as well. One of the Leveler writers said, even the Magna Carta is but a feeble thing. And they gradually came and finally came to the conclusion that everyone has, by nature, inalienable rights. That that word in the Declaration of Independence, inalienable. What does it mean?
Non-transferable.
Huh?
Non-transferable.
Not transferable. It means basically that you couldn't even give away your rights if you wanted to. Just like you can't live by eating grass. It's not your nature. So you cannot give your rights away. You always have them. They're part of your nature as a human being. Now, this was, and Murray says this is the beginning of liberalism. In the 18th century, finally what happens, as you know, probably, is that James II goes too far and is chased out. His daughter, who is a Stuart, and her Dutch husband, William and Mary, become the rulers, and basically this is the victory of Parliament over the king. The 18th century is the century of the consolidation and basic theorizing of liberalism. Really now, for the first time, economic science comes into the picture. As Murray points out, more with the French, really, Turgot, more than Adam Smith. Murray had a thing against Adam Smith. But nonetheless, Adam Smith is in the direction of laissez-faire, although he equivocates. But all over, theoreticians are coming along that proclaim what we would recognize easily as liberalism. Now, and since England won what was basically a liberal or quasi-liberal revolt against absolutism and prospered, obviously. The English were the richest people in Europe. They won wars. They had this empire. That conveyed the idea of the superiority of liberal ways in a demonstration effect to others. Finally, the great demonstration effect will come into existence, and that's the United States. Joyce Appleby of UCLA says that what happened was that the American colonies had virtually no government at all. And they discovered, amazingly, that didn't make much of a difference. That people could combine and associate together for common goals and be enormously successful. I had a good quote from this is Thomas Paine. Okay, great part of that order which reigns among mankind is not the effect of government. It has its origin in the principles of society and the natural constitution of man. It existed prior to government and would exist if the formality of government was abolished. In fine, society performs for itself almost everything which is ascribed to government. By the way, a short definition of liberalism, I would say, is the political position that a society defined as the social order minus the state and given broad acceptance of individual rights more or less runs itself. That more or less is a little wiggle room to accommodate a range of liberals. So finally, the American colonists revolted against George III and decided to secede from the British Empire. This was not really you could call it a revolution, but it basically what they wanted to do simply was secede and mind their own business, and if you let us secede, fine, let us go in peace. And they set up Madison and the others what they thought was a constitution that would guarantee individual freedom. It set up a central government of strictly limited and delegated powers. If you get a chance and you're not clear about it, read the Bill of Rights. The Ninth Amendment says that the enumeration of rights here shall not be taken to disparage other rights. In other words, we didn't mention here that people have the freedom to marry, they have the freedom to travel, and so on. Those are understood. And the 10th Amendment says that the powers not given by this Constitution to the central government shall be reserved to the states, respectively, and to the people. In other words, the central government was a government of strictly delegated powers, narrowly understood. That United States came to an end in 1865 at Appomattox with the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. Well, plenty more to say, and I'll deal with maybe a little more in my talk tomorrow on war and peace. Thank you.